Hey everybody, hope you're doing great today. In this video, I'm going to look at the current rate of inflation. Where is it at? Has it gone down much? And look at some possible future scenarios with regards to inflation. So inflation is off of its recent highs, where in the recent past we had an inflation rate as high as 9%. Now it has come down a little bit to 6%. So even at 6%, inflation is pretty high. Inflation has shifted from goods, now more into services. And within the services area, it is pretty sticky. It hasn't shown any sign of abating, especially as costs remain high. Employees are demanding higher wages, especially when they're job hopping. They're looking for higher wages in order to meet the cost of living. Rents are still high. Mortgage rates are higher now. So that leads to an overall problem in the economy, in that inflation hurts the average everyday consumer by making things more expensive for them and taking what they would have had budget-wise in the past under a low inflation regime and throwing everything out the door. So over the short term, over the next few months, inflation will come down, and that's going to come down based on the base effect. So let's take a look at what base effect means. Here's a page from Investopedia.com. What is the base effect definition and how it works? So with regards to inflation, the base effect is looking at two different points in time and then comparing that rate of change. So if we go to a time where inflation was very low and compared to a time now where it's high, that percentage of change is going to be very high. Versus today, inflation is high relative to a year or two ago, but relative to a month ago, it's not as high. So for an example, let's take a look at the BLS.gov, the Bureau of Labor Statistics government website. Take a look at the Consumer Price Index for all urban consumers. On the chart, we have data for 1 month changes as well as the 12-month changes. So the blue line over here, as you can see, this is the month over month change, and there's not much variation since month over month the changes are small. So if you're going from 6% to 6.2%, that change month over month is not great. But then when you look at the 12-month time frame, for example, here in June 2022, we had a high of 9.1%. And then a few months later here in February 2023, we're at 6%. So it is a big drop on the yearly basis, but looking at the month over month basis, it's not that big of a drop. So inflation is coming down in part due to the base effect, since we're comparing it still to a high level. So here on the Federal Reserve website, where they've got Consumer Price Index less food and energy, we can also see the numbers are still high. Looking back a couple years ago, the numbers were relatively low in comparison to this chart. We can even go back to 1980, where the numbers were in the 15% range. So while we are seeing a little dip in these numbers over here in the recent past months, January 2023, February 2023, but you look at similarly in the past, and usually we look at history as a guide. So we did have a drop here. If you look at February 1975, it peaked and then it dropped. Then a couple years later, we had another higher peak. So there is a possibility that we have another higher peak in the US in terms of inflation, because there's a number of things going on. Globalization is reversing. Rather than being able to export our inflation to countries that are able to produce cheaper than we can, there's a reverse trend going on. Onshoring is going on. We're bringing back manufacturing. Perfect example of that is central processing units, CPUs, and other microchips. So with the geopolitical risk of Taiwan over there, which produces a majority of the world's chips, and China having issues with Taiwan, so that geopolitical situation with Taiwan and China represents a flashpoint, just as we had a flashpoint with Russia and Ukraine. As Russia invaded Ukraine, Russian access to the global economic system was reduced. Embargoes were put on their exports of oil, of other energy like natural gas, as well as raw materials. So Russia does sell a lot of raw materials that supply our electronics industries, our car industries. So that's impacted the prices of everything due to the limited availability of those. Now, if China and Taiwan become a war zone, if that becomes hot, then that could also further push up the rate of inflation here in the US. In response to any invasion, in response to any attack, the US will embargo some products from China. There could even be 100% cutoff. We don't know. I don't know what the politicians will be doing. It'll be for them to decide. At the same time, too, if China wants to throw their weight around, a lot of the supplies that we get, a lot of the raw materials, a lot of the electronics are made in China. If they were to cut us off 100%, that would cause a severe strain on the US economy. As mentioned before, the prices of services have gone up while inflation in goods have started to level off. The inflation has taken off in services, as you can see from this chart here on the Federal Reserve website. Going back to January 2020, around the COVID time, we did have a little dip in the CPI for services. Ever since then, with a lot of stimulus, a lot of tax breaks, PPP programs, the CPI for services just skyrocketed up. So when it comes to services, prices in there can be sticky. As you give employees raises, it's hard to claw those wages back. So that's going to stay in the system, increase costs for everything, and that gets passed around. Here's a chart showing the M2, which is the measure of money supply, basically how many dollars are out there circulating in the economy. And starting in 2002, there was a big spike in the supply of money in order to help us get through the COVID crisis. And as inflation has raged, the Federal Reserve made a commitment to bring inflation back down. And as part of that process, they've been withdrawing money from the circulation in the economy in order to help bring that inflation down. And as you can see from that peak, there's still quite a bit of money in the system, but the Federal Reserve is slowly bringing that down, and that will also have an impact on inflation. With too many dollars chasing fewer goods, that will increase the price of things, that will cause inflation. As you draw money out of the economy, less money chasing the same amount of goods, that's going to keep prices stable, or even in some cases might bring it down. So while the base effect of inflation will go down, looking at the year-over-year basis, we're going from high rates to starting to go down. So those numbers are going to go down, but whether that inflation comes down overall, if you're looking past a year, my thoughts are the inflation is going to stay at the current levels, and depending on geopolitical activities, whether there's further wars, further trade wars, or further actions by governments to invade other countries, that throws everything out the door, and inflation could rage much harder, much higher then. The hands of the Fed are going to be tied because dropping rates too low will cause other issues, so we may end up in a stagflation situation. Before I sign off, let me talk about inflation from the month of March. Inflation came in at 5%, so 5% year over year from last year, March 2022. Now the problem with that is, while inflation did come down, let's look at oil prices. Oil prices were down for the month. Oil prices were down in the low 70s, and that also resulted in gas prices going down. But now let's look at oil prices today. Where did they go? So OPEC recently announced they're cutting back production. So as a result, the oil prices are back up. So from the low 70s, now back into the 80s. So same time too, that means gas prices are going to go up too. So the low prices for oil and gas were baked into the cake for March. Let's see how April and May come back with oil prices, since the numbers there should also reflect higher energy prices as well. Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Do you think inflation is going to come down? Do you think it's going to stay the same, or do you think it's going to go up? That's all I have for this video. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.